struggling to expose the myths that our media is promoting about Syria. She is the national co-ordinator of Australians for Mussalaha, which is reconciliation, and her topic is valuing secularism in Syria. You'll make her very welcome.
I'm an ESL teacher, so I've always got props. So I struggle with them sometimes. I've got too many. I'm very grateful to Marion and Peter and the church for inviting me here, and I'm very grateful to you all for coming on such a miserable December day. I'll just put down my books. I'd like to begin actually by reading something by Graham Greene, who is one of my favourite authors and an inspiration to me. He said in his book, A Man from Havana, which is about an ordinary English man that's picked up by MI6 and sort of forced by circumstances to join MI6. This is what the character says. I don't give a damn about men who are loyal to the people who pay them, to organisations. I don't even think my country means that much. There are many countries in my blood, aren't there, but only one person. Would the world be in the mess it is if we were loyal to love and not to countries? He also says, in the book, A Man from Havana, he had no accomplice except the credulity of other men. And I think that tells us a lot about how we've got to this point in the war in Syria, how it's taken 3-4 years for this war to be ongoing and no peace activists, no big groups of peace activists to stand up and try and stop it. I lived in Syria for 2 years. I was teaching at the British Council, so I got to know hundreds of Syrian people. And it's those Syrian people that I met and the Syria that I explored that's in my heart that motivates me to be a peace activist. I was also a peace activist during the 1960s, 70s, anti-Vietnam War peace activists. And I realised then how important it was to investigate, to research, to understand what was really going on and to expose the lies, and to know that there were a lot of men from Havana, a lot of people working for war, otherwise you'd have no war. And many of those men and women, of course, were very innocuous. We didn't always recognise them. The Syria I know is a secular country, a country where you could find faith. Syrian people of all faiths are very religious, very devout, I think in a very genuine way. Generally, that's the impression I got, and where there was love and hope. So supporting that country was supporting love, supporting secularism. In Syria, it was generally taboo, the Syria I know, it was taboo to talk about religion, to ask people about their religion. So it was frowned upon. It was a subject, if you did deal with it, you dealt with it with sensitivity and with respect. And I believe that this gave the people of Syria one of the most precious freedoms that anyone can have. And that's the freedom to approach others in your society, no matter what their religious or ethnic background, with an open heart. But that's been destroyed now by those people who wish to destroy Syria. I have a faith in secular Syria because it's the Syria I know. There are good reasons for that faith. One is the position of women. Women in Syria have the same basic rights as women in Australia. So they had the freedom to dress as they choose, freedom to seek an education, to seek a career. One of my students at the British Council, who was very capable, very highly intelligent woman, aimed to become become the Minister of Health, which wasn't necessarily a dream. When I was in Syria with a peace delegation last year, I met the Minister for Community Services, who was a woman, Kinder Shamat, very, very impressive woman. As I said, there was freedom of religion. This meant that Christmas was a national holiday, Easter was a national holiday, and the Eid festivals were national holidays. Everybody celebrated each other's national holiday. Life was a struggle, but there was hope, and people did their best. Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It's part of everybody's humanity. Syria is basically a bridge between religious faiths. If you go to Syria, you will feel this. It's in the air. There's something special in the air in Syria, particularly in Damascus and also Aleppo, just this older city. It's got a diverse population because Syria's been invaded over millennia by many different armies. The population is very diverse. So you see people with green eyes, blue eyes, red hair, blonde hair. It's quite extraordinary, and that's one thing that people value in Syria. And they value their independence, they value the strong stand they've taken on the world stage. They've been independent of America, they've been independent of Israel, they've been independent of the Gulf states. They don't want this to change. The faiths in Syria are inclusive. So these days you can see imams in churches, you can see priests in mosques if you watch Syrian TV. I support Syria. I've got good reason to support Syria and the people of Syria, particularly the people of Syria. But if I ring up a radio station, I'm told that I'm an Assad supporter. Labels are being used to quash discussion, to quash debate and peace activism, and they've been effective. These are used, Assad versus the rebels is the slogan, and this slogan's been very, very powerful because it's intimidated people. People are too afraid to stand up because to be seen as a supporter of Assad is almost like being a supporter of Hitler. Nobody dares go there. And those lined up against Syria, basically the whole world, except for Russia, China, Central America, Latin America, India, Oman, South Africa. There are some notable exceptions, but we're very rarely informed about them because the international community is said to be against Assad, but actually the international community is just America and its allies. So you have one of the problems, I think, in people standing up against Syria is that you've got NGOs such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, speaking against Syria, using emotive language. And in people's minds, these bodies are almost bodies that God has produced or touched, but they're not. These bodies, Amnesty International, for example, although there are some very, very good people working for them, people with integrity, good intentions, of course, but today it's not the Amnesty that I knew when I was a member 40 years ago, when it was a grassroots organisation. Today it's a corporate body that has security doors, that has executive salaries, that sells merchandise, and that has a headquarters. And we took, members of the Syrian community and activists, took stories to Amnesty International at the end of December 2011. Stories of people being killed in Syria. For example, 3 children were killed on the 17th of April 2011 by armed men in Homs. They were in a car. And I think they were targeted because the car had army number plates. It was Independence Day, it was a holiday. They were with the father of 2 of the children. The car was targeted by armed men and the 4 of them were killed. We took that story to Amnesty International, and the people here in Melbourne and Sydney were very receptive. They sent it to headquarters. Headquarters wouldn't print it, wouldn't publish it. Headquarters at that time was very close, and I think still is, to the US administration. Suzanne Nozzle was elected as the leader of US Amnesty. Suzanne Nozzle wrote Smart Power and has close links with the State Department. But to know all this requires investigation, requires time, requires care, and perhaps unless you're like me, perhaps unless you've met those Syrian people, unless you've been in Syria, you don't commit yourself to that, and so the war can go on. So I don't see myself as an Assad supporter. I see myself as a supporter of Syria, a supporter of the Syrian people, and I support diplomacy, I support peaceful resolution to problems, and I support the Syrian secular state. There are many lobbyists for war in Australia and in the rest of the world, few lobbyists for peace. I think one of the reasons for this is you get paid to lobby for war. You don't get paid to lobby for peace. In 2012, 2011 as well, I've been sending emails to long lists of people, including media, people in the media and politicians. And one of the people on my email list was Bob Brown. I was very disturbed by the Greens' stand on Syria, and Bob Brown was supporting, and the Greens were supporting sanctions against Syria. They were supporting the closure of the embassy, not diplomacy, the closure of the embassy, and they called on the Senate to renew its call for President Assad to resign. It's just extraordinary that people in Australia that know nothing about Syria, have never been to Syria, can tell their government, Assad, you've got to resign, and just ignore the Syrian people. There are 23 million people in Syria, the same population as Australia, but they have been ignored. So I sent an email to Bob Brown, I included him in my list, and I got an email response from his office. That was in March. I replied to that email response specifically, and I said a few things in that email. One was that I was aware of a few Syrians in the community lobbying a Greens member, a Greens politician, a local one, a Victorian one, because I was at a meeting where she spoke on their behalf, on behalf of the militarised opposition, not the political opposition. There are two oppositions, the militarised opposition, which is supported by the West, by America, by the Gulf states, by Turkey, and then there's the political opposition, the internal opposition, which exists in Syria, but we hear nothing about that. So these local Syrians, 2 or 3 of them, were lobbying Colleen Hartland, a Greens politician, and she spoke at this meeting and she encouraged them to present their stories, the more personal the better, present their stories to the media, present their stories to politicians. And all I could think of when I heard that was, what about the other stories? What about the stories of the people getting killed by the army? What about the stories of terror? And the other thing I said in the letter to Bob Brown was, you're probably reading Robert Fisk, which is fine, but Robert Fisk doesn't represent the Syrian people. Robert Fisk, if he represents anyone, probably represents Walid Jablat, because in my mind, Walid Jablat, who is a Druze warlord, someone would say, is his patron, his best friend perhaps in Lebanon. And Walid Jablat is a Lebanese politician who's renowned for being very, very fickle in his support for different political groups. And so Robert Fisk was very unpredictable in his reporting on Syria, and very cryptic as well. And he also didn't represent 23 million Syrian people. And also Al Jazeera, I said to Bob Brown, you're probably reading Al Jazeera, trusting Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera represents the Qatari foreign policy. Al Jazeera is owned by the royal family in Qatar. The US has a major military base in Qatar. You can't trust Al Jazeera. Many reporters have resigned from Al Jazeera at the start of its reporting on the Syrian crisis. One of the reporters that I was aware of was the head of the Beirut office, who resigned from Al Jazeera because of its reporting on Syria, its biased reporting, as well as it's basically ignoring Bahrain and what was happening in Bahrain. And I also mentioned to Bob Brown the problem with Amnesty and how Amnesty wasn't reporting on the killings by the armed men. I'm not sure whether there's a connection or not, but I like to say Bob Brown resigned because of Syria, because 3 weeks after I sent that email, Bob Brown resigned. Okay? But whether he did or not, it's irrelevant. What I want to draw attention to is the fact that it's so hard to stand up for peace in Syria. It's so hard, and I could not have imagined Bob Brown being able to say to the Australian community, I was wrong about Syria. It's much more complicated, and perhaps there is an agenda for war. If he had done that, he could probably do it today, but if he had done that then, he would have been damned and been accused of being an Assad apologist. The perspective of people living in Syria, I think we've got to remember that. They've got an historic perspective. They know what's happened to their country in the last 100 years. So they remember World War I, they remember the Turkish getting kicked out. They basically kicked them out with the help, of course, of the Anzacs. The Anzacs were in Damascus even before Lawrence of Arabia. I know that because my grandfather was with them. And after World War I, the Syrians had good reason to expect to be able to become an independent country, but they couldn't, because Britain, as you probably all know, Britain and France wouldn't allow it. France invaded Syria in 1920. It bombed a part of the old city of Damascus, destroyed a part of the old city of Damascus in 1925. And again in 1945, it was de Gaulle's Free French forces at that point that tried to hold on to Syria and so attacked the Syrian parliament building in Damascus. But they were forced out, eventually they were forced out, and independence was achieved in 1946. I think perhaps America was happy about that. Britain was probably happy too, because France was no longer in control. In 1949, CIA agents were able to help organise the first successful military coup in Syria. And one CIA agent behind that coup was a man called Miles Copeland. I think he's an interesting person to give attention to. He was a trumpet player in the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and his father was a doctor, his wife was an archaeologist. I'd like to draw attention to him because he's a nice guy. He's a guy that you would trust if you met him. He's a guy that you would probably respect if you met him. There's a bit of glamour behind someone who's been working for the Glenn Miller Orchestra. But he was working for America. He was prepared to topple the government of another country for pay or for his country. The CIA tried to overthrow Syrian governments again, 1956, 1957. So there's been a lot of instability in Syria. In around 20 years, they had 14 different presidents. And then you had Hafez al-Assad, taking charge in 1970 in a bloodless coup. And I think there's something I'd like to quote from a speech he gave, which indicates that Syria was under attack, not just now, but it's been under attack by its neighbours at different points in its history in the last 100 years. President Assad, at that time, 1982, said this about Saddam Hussein: "The hangman of Iraq was not content to kill tens of thousands of his own people. He came to Syria to carry out his favourite hobbies of killing, assassination and sabotage. That man has been sending arms to the criminals in Syria ever since he took power." He said that in 1982 because that was towards the end of a reign of terror by the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And the Muslim Brotherhood has also been using terror tactics in recent years. It couldn't do that unless it had support from outside powers, and Iraq was one of its supporters. Of course, Syria wouldn't have the problems it has today, perhaps, if it weren't for Israel. One of the plans that was formed in Israel some decades ago is Greater Israel, which calls for the balkanization of the Arab states. So the making of weak, small and weak Arab states so Israel could dominate in the Middle East while Muslims kill each other in endless sectarian wars. One of the chants first heard at demonstrations in Syria was Christians to Beirut and Alawis to their graves. So already that hatred between sects was being fermented from the beginning at rallies. The Middle East expert, I'll just grab his book, Patrick Seal. If you want to know anything about the history of Syria, this is really well worth reading. Patrick Seal died this year. He's very highly regarded. He's a Middle East expert, and he wrote this biography with a lot of historical context of President Assad. At the end of it, in his conclusion, Seal says, Assad's Syria represents the rejection of an Israeli-dominated Middle East order, offering instead one based on the supremacy of neither Arabs nor Israelis, but on a balance of power between an Arab Levant centred on Damascus and an Israel within its 1948-49 boundaries. And Seal pointed out that Israel would have to give up its ambition to dominate and substitute it for a will to coexist. I don't know if that's possible, but people should try. That's looking at Israel, but also in America. Some of you may have heard of Wesley Clark, the US General Wesley Clark, who after 9/11 was told by someone in the Pentagon that there had been a policy coup in America, a policy coup. So this is referencing the neocons, and that there was an aim to remove 7 countries, including Iraq, Syria, Libya and Iran. So US had 5 years. The reason behind this, US was given 5 years to clean up any regimes who had been sympathetic or supported by the Soviet Union before another superpower emerged to challenge America. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to before I close is the information war against Syria. People will say to me, Assad's got to go, he's massacring his people. And I'll say, well, what's your evidence? Give me a massacre. Tell me when this massacre happened. give me information about it. One of the massacres that's brought to our attention is the alleged chemical attack in Ghouta. And Walid Ali, who is a respected commentator in Australia, wrote in June just this year that Assad was responsible for it, and it was basically a pity that America didn't take military action when it could. But that attack was most probably carried out by rebels. It was most probably a false flag. And it's not just me saying this, there's an MIT physicist, Theodore Postel, and a UN weapons inspector, a former UN weapons inspector, Richard Lloyd, that have written a long report which explain how the rebels most probably did it, the government couldn't have done it. There's been a partisan discourse, sectarian and partisan discourse, which has blamed the Syrian regime, not the government, the regime, the Syrian army, particularly the Alawite president, even though you have basically a Sunni majority government, Sunni majority ministry in Syria, we're told it's an Alawite regime. So the sectarian and the partisan discourse must have had some impact on the local Muslim community here. I wonder, why do young men leave Australia, go and become jihadis in Syria? Why did that 17-year-old boy go with his 3 brothers to Syria? And I don't just look at perhaps extremist clerics that have influenced them, the videos from ISIS that have influenced them. I also look at our own media. BTN, Behind the News, ABC BTN, which is directed at school children. Just 2 years ago, there was their first report on Syria. Yeah, and the report talked about the protests in Syria and how people didn't have the freedom to protest. And it ended by saying they want the freedom to choose new leaders, but without help from outside, winning that freedom is going to be difficult and deadly to achieve. So there's been a call from our media, indirectly, and sometimes it seems almost directly, to young people, go and support the rebels in Syria, the rebels who are supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, America, to destroy the Syria I know. So the conclusion is who to support, who to trust. I think the best thing I can advise for anybody is to go to Syria, meet the Syrian people, get to know the Syrian society that's been destroyed by war machines that have always been at work. They haven't changed. Go and meet the Syrian people and speak on their behalf. There is the Bible. Can I quote from the Bible? This is Isaiah 17, Damascus. Damascus shall be a city no longer, she shall be but a heap of ruins. There are some people that refer to that and say we are meant to destroy Syria. God tells us we are meant to destroy Syria. I don't believe that. I think Syria, Damascus, is the beating heart of the world. If Damascus is destroyed, we are all destroyed. One day, of course, we will be, but I think we should delay that day. Thank you.
The drought has been going on for a while due to global warming. I suppose there's a river there and it dried up. And the farmers were in extreme hardship. They don't have food to eat, but the government did not do much to alleviate their suffering. So therefore, they say that is actually one of the effects of global warming. You can see that it can start all these, uprising against the government. What's the comment on that?
When I was living there, I lived there in 2003, 2004, 2005, and I've been back several years for visits. I wasn't aware of people not having enough food to eat. I was aware of the droughts, of course, and I think water is a huge factor in the Middle East, and wars could be fought over water, definitely. But in regards to the government supporting the people, I think my impression of Syrian people is that they're very, very supportive of each other, and there would be huge pressures on different government agencies to support the people. And that poverty, there is poverty, definitely. There was poverty, still is poverty. That poverty in Syria is spread across all groups. So I visited an Alawite family, for example, in one region, which was a very poor family. So I think the poverty, definitely, and those difficult conditions were exploited by the enemies of Syria, most definitely.
Yeah, I am feeling pain, and what you said about Amnesty International is extremely enlightening. Just wondering, every day I get requests for donations for children from Barnabas Fund, UNICEF, Christian Blind Mission, Médecins Sans Frontières. In your opinion, I'm a bit worried now. Do you recommend, which one would you recommend for us to donate to in Syria? It seems that some of them are not what they purport to be.
I would be very wary of any NGO at the moment. I think they have to try and get donations, and they do that almost in any way they can. I think there are one or two Australian groups that work within Syria. I would check those groups that actually have people on the ground in Syria, not just in the refugee camps. The refugees have been used as pawns for the war, the refugees, the people outside Syria. So, for example, I was very disappointed in World Vision. I've spoken to someone from World Vision. I met her with Mother Agnes, and this person from World Vision knew the situation in Syria very, very well as Mother Agnes did, much better than I do, but they weren't reporting it because they have to get money, so they tell the narrative. And I was disappointed for that reason. I was also disappointed because they would quote people from the refugee camps. They would quote the claims of one or two refugees which were just anti-regime. They could have been true, they could have been false. To me, they were so outrageous that they were false. So I would check if that NGO has offices in Damascus, is working with the Syrian Red Cross, then I think there's a reason to support them.
The Greens are a broad church, and are there people in the Greens, such as Leanne, beyond take a more critical view? So that's the first question. The second question, even though there are all kinds of movements out there, the climate movement, the climate global justice movement, what has happened to the peace movement? Why has it gone into such a lull, not just on Syria, but Afghanistan, Iraq, etc.?
In regards to the Greens, I'm sure there are individuals within the party that understand very well what's going on in Syria, and also within the Labour Party, because there are people within their electorates that will tell them, particularly people within the Christian community, Syrian Christians. But the problem is there's a policy. So I was in touch with the Greens official who was based in Hobart, in charge of their foreign affairs policy. And at the beginning she was very, very receptive, but as she had more lobbying, I suppose, from other groups, She wasn't receptive to me at all, and she told me that they follow the policy of the Greens in Germany, or the European Greens, and so the door was shut on me. But I think Adam Bant was open, his office has been open, but I don't know that they can speak up. And Sarah Hanson-Young, there's a very strong peace group in Hobart working for peace in Syria, and they have a connection with Sarah Hanson-Young, a personal connection, but I can't see her speaking. I haven't heard her speak out for Syria. I think, yeah, people just don't have the courage, and it's so difficult to really stand up against the narrative. You need to do a lot of research. You need almost a full-time research, and people aren't committed to that. And that goes to the problem with the peace groups as well, to a certain extent. It needs, I think, when I was involved in the peace groups in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of the action was from men like my brother, who's a draft resistor, and they were motivated to act because there was a chance that they could go to war. So it touched them personally. So few people here are touched personally, so they're not motivated, and they just get on with their lives. The Syrian people are touched personally, but there's a lot of intimidation. There was one man called George in the Sydney community, a Syrian Christian, who was very active, was lobbying politicians, was in touch with me, but then he shut down because somebody had come along and shot at his car, did great damage to his car, and he told me he was just afraid for his children, so he just shut up.
There are two more questions, and I please ask you to keep them brief because we are running behind time. So Peter first.
Yes, thank you, Susan, for the address. When you mentioned Rob Brown, I think, no, I was going to say I despair, but I look at the progressive people, right? Chap you mentioned, Wally Dowie, others, I think they're running scared. And I think the effect of propaganda, a lot of the progressive movement, the very broad progressive movement, I think is really being silenced. The effect of propaganda is enormous. And I remember, this is probably going back about 6 months, Noam Chomsky was one of those interviews with him, and he was talking about imperialism, and he said, why do you think they only invade Iraq, Syria, and Gaddafi in Libya? Why don't they go into Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and so forth? He said that those regimes are pretty bad, and they go, but I mean, really, the whole aims of it, and I think you've alluded to it, is the nature of imperialism. There's ones that don't support the imperial agenda, and there's those that do. I think Gaddafi is one that, I mean, pretty evil sort of bloke, but he stepped, I think what was going to happen with Gaddafi was that he was going to change the currency, the oil currency, over to euros rather than the American dollar. So I think all those things that people just don't consider them, they don't join the dots. And I do worry about the progressive movement being scared and the effect of propaganda. Sorry for being so long-winded.
Susan, thank you for a terrific. Thank you for that terrific talk. What I'd like to say is even people who are sympathetic to Syria and even like Bashar al-Assad, including the Syrian girl, this YouTube personality, the Syrian girl, hold that Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, was a brutal dictator who often massacred his own people. Now, it seems to me that in the context of the wars and conflict that you described, that possibly it was understandable in order to hold on to power and stop Syria being partitioned and invaded, that his seemingly brutal acts were probably necessary. But it's possible as a consequence of the brutal civil war that Hafez al-Assad had to fight, that even loyal Syrians may have suffered. That may explain why the Syrian girl's own family was forced to flee from Syria to, or eventually to Australia. Do you think that may explain what has happened?
It's really difficult to talk about 30 years of history, and again going back to that point about massacres, you really need to point to our massacre and look at it and research it. And I would highly recommend Patrick Seale's book. I don't think anyone's innocent. My philosophy of life is that we're all guilty, we're all innocent. And I think that's true about Syria. And the one thing that disturbs me greatly about the narrative on Syria is that it's Assad versus the rebels. It's not Assad versus the rebels, it's the Syrian people, it's the Syrian army, Syrian political opposition versus the rebels and the rest of the world behind them, whatever that world is. And going to Peter's point about Chomsky and the left, I noticed that John Pilter's written an article about the propaganda and how it's because of the propaganda that we are taken into these wars. If only journalists would tell the truth, millions wouldn't get killed. That's true, but 4 years ago, nearly 4 years ago, I was trying to contact John Pilger. If only John Pilger would wake up and see that the same thing is happening. Wake up at the beginning of the war, not at the point in the war when you're taking your support base with you. Wake up early, stand up, don't be afraid to stand up. Even if you're alone, stand up if you know that you're doing it for truth and for love. But these people have something to protect. They've got their status, they've got their support base to protect. They don't stand up. And that's one of the reasons we have wars.
Oh, thank you. Susan, you haven't mentioned, Bashar al-Assad is often described as an unelected dictator, but there were recent elections in Syria which had an outstanding turnout, and they hadn't been covered in the Western media with any accuracy, even though there was a UN group reporting witnesses to the election. Just wonder if you might comment on that.
My impression when I was living in Syria was that Bashar al-Assad was a highly regarded leader, and people would damn the regime. They might have used that word regime too, because of course there's a lot of corruption in Syria. There is an old guard in Syria. There may still be an old guard in Syria, and people saw Bashar al-Assad as coming and bringing hope to Syrians because he was young, he was educated, he'd spent time in Britain, he was a doctor, his wife was brought up in London, she was born in London, she was an investment banker, he was Alawite, she was Sunni, so you had the two worlds, so there was a lot of hope. And so yes, definitely, when there was an election, I think it was in June, I think there was a 72%, something like 72% turnout and 80%, or just over 80% vote for him. So yes, I would say he's very popular, and I think you've got to look at what he says. He's been interviewed quite often. There are lots of interviews of Bashar al-Assad on YouTube. You've got to listen to him. You can't just damn him, because he does represent the Syrian people, and you've got to listen to what he says.